there's a lie that is based on some truth in education. And that's a very quiet assumption that we make all the time. We really normally don't talk about it, but I think that it's time for us to take a quick look at it. And that assumption is kind of simple. Some students are meant to succeed, some students are meant to struggle, and most of them would fall somewhere in the middle. I'm sure every teacher has probably heard this before or seen it happen in some way. And if you're a student, most likely you've heard of this as well. And in education, that looks like realism. We call it fairness. And sometimes, if you ask teachers, they'll tell you that is real data. But I have a question. What if we are confusing a statistical model with actual human truth? And when you look at statistics and all of that, there's this concept that we call the bell curve. In fact, that kind of curve. And of course, that's what is used in statistics a lot of times. But my question then is, what if the bell curve is not describing intelligence, but rather it's manufacturing failure? A big question, right? And I think we need to talk about it right here and now. Because if you think about so many natural measurements that exist, like for example, if we take height, you would realize that a lot of those measurements would cluster around the average, right? And a very small number of them will fall at the extreme. So if you take height, probably just a few people are very tall, just a few people are very short. Most of us are around an average range, okay? And that makes sense to a lot of us because if you take things like that, very few people fall at the extremes. And I think a lot of biological traits also happen this way. But my question then is why education actually adopted this? Because we took that statistical model and we applied it to human learning. And then for some reason, we built grading systems around it. And if you ask, that's what they'll tell you is normative grading. The assumption that performance needs to spread out. So some students would get A's, many will get C's, some of them would definitely get the D's, the E's, and the F's. And that's really not my problem. My problem is if too many students begin to perform well, then there's suspicion. It's either the exam was too easy. But I think that we need to pause and think about it. If every student is meeting the learning objective, is that really a failure of assessment or is actually a success of teaching? Think about it, really. Is it really a failure of assessment or a success of teaching? And I think we need to start having a very serious conversation about it. So let's go back to early history or probably the very deep roots about it. If you do a quick research, you'll realize that this whole idea started from somewhere the early 20th century when we began to expand schools really, really rapidly. And of course, when we are doing something on a large scale, it means that we need some mechanism to make it efficient, right? I'm sure you agree with me on this one. So obviously, large school or large scale like kind of education needed some form of sorting mechanisms because not everybody can just enter into the university. Not everybody can just go to a particular class. You needed some kind of filter to be able to put some people in there and also reject some people. So I think by that system, we created some selection filters. And obviously, employers within that space also needed some signals. We need to be able to tell who is good for the job space and who is not. So it means that grades became that efficient indicator. And I won't disagree, grades are efficient, but all the time or most often, they are very blunt. And you see, my problem is at some point, what we teachers see as rigor now tweaked a bit, changed, and became sorting. What we call excellence has now shifted and drifted into the space of ranking. And I think that slowly education is beginning to drift. It has really drifted. As of now, if you go to so many schools, you begin to see that the question is no longer how did you learn or even did you even learn to now how do you compare against some people. And that's a really dangerous thing that I think we need to really pay attention to. And that's why we are having this conversation. So stay with me and let's analyze this together. I think that at this point, it's important for us to bring one of the most influential educational thinkers of that particular century. And that guy is Benjamin Bloom. Now, you see, Bloom challenged the inevitability of failure. So, people say failure is inevitable. So he began to challenge that narrative. And he introduced the idea of what we call mastery learning. So obviously he did some research, but his research showed something really radical. What Bloom was saying is that if you give every student sufficient time, appropriate feedback, you give them targeted support, the vast majority of students can achieve very high levels of understanding. Not some, not the 10%, not the majority, but in fact, he is saying the vast majority of these students should be able to reach those high levels. So if it's the A's we are talking about or the B pluses, Bloom is saying that it really is not the majority clustered around the C. If you have the right conditions, then the vast majority of students should be able to get the A's or the B plus. And obviously, the implication of this research is really disruptive. It means that for him, failure is really not a fixed rate of every learner. It's not true. It was actually a function of time, the method that was used to teach, and even opportunity. But you see, if you think about it deeply, you realize that mastery learning requires a lot of flexibility. And obviously, it requires patience. And it also requires that you abandon those pacing schedules that we have in schools. Because, for example, the term is supposed to have maybe 4 months or 3 months. You need to abandon those kind of schedules. You need to create somewhat flexible schedules around this because you're thinking about the individual learner. But you see, when you think of the normative grading that we use now, it fits very neatly into those fixed calendars. So obviously it moves on schedule. But when you take Bloom's idea, kind of, I don't think it can fit on schedule, if I'll be very honest. Even though it's quite radical and puts students at the very center, it really doesn't run on schedule. But my worry now is if we can accept this truth that failure is not a function of students, but it's a function of time, patience, and sometimes even opportunity, I'm beginning to think of this question. What happens psychologically when we begin to label students below average? Because obviously in the general age and with normative grading, when students are below average, we still see that as data. It's okay for students to perform that way if some of them cluster around the average. And what about those below average? And I think that the phrase itself is quite revealing because there are some questions I'm asking myself. Below average compared to whom? Under what conditions? After how much time? With what support did you give them? But you see, once you begin to label them, something very dangerous happens. I think that the expectations for these individuals or students begins to shift. And because I am a teacher, I like to think most of the time within the space of teachers or maybe the perspective of teachers. I think that what happens with us, and I've seen that a lot of times, is that unconsciously we begin to lower the cognitive demand for these students. So if I'm thinking some student who is an A student should be able to perform a task, my expectation of the student that I've labeled as below average really is different. And I think that after some time, these students themselves begin to internalize that identity. I think that I need to share something here. I once saw one of my students, after a couple of students called me to come check up on the students in the washroom. And my student was really in tears. When I remember that each day, it's quite a painful thing to talk about. And I remember I did give my student that level of motivation that they needed. But the whole concept here was that my student had felt so down because not just him, but a number of students kept saying that it was below average in not a nice way. I can't say that here, but and at some point he had internalized that idea, and it's really dangerous. If the only problem here is that a lot of times teachers don't see this. It depends on how close you are to students and how much they are willing to share with you. But there's a real danger that we really experience once we begin to label students. So obviously their peers adjusted their perception of these students. And I think that at some point it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if I'm told repeatedly through grades that I'm average or I'm below average, then obviously I'll begin to calibrate my ambition according to that. Not really because that student lacks capacity, but it's simply because the system has quantified the kind of ceiling that that student can reach. And that's really where I begin to have a problem with the current system that we have. So yeah, it may have produced some results, but it has really huge dangers when we begin to label students. Not really for those who are probably within the average. Of course, they still have damages, or those above average, but particularly for those that are below average. Now, let me go to one guy who also contributed to this conversation and is a huge writer, is an educator. His name is Alfie Kohn. So, if you probably want to read about him, you can also read about it. For him, a lot of his writing and education has always been that competitive grading undermines intrinsic motivation. And let me just pause here a bit. So, if you are not into education and you don't understand intrinsic motivation, is that the motivation that comes from within? That's what intrinsic motivation means. So, if you hear extrinsic motivation, motivation that comes externally. So, what Con is saying here is that when you begin to have competitive grading, like we see every day, you begin to undermine that intrinsic motivation that exists. And his conversation is not really just about students below average, it's all the students. But particularly, I could still say that those below average feel this on a whole different level. So, what he says is that when you begin to put students in that constant comparison with themselves, learning becomes secondary to performance. That's what he's saying. And the danger here is that he recognizes that at the core of learning is really what we call collaboration. And I'm sure if you're watching this video, you agree with me, because if we are saying that, and think of workspaces, for example, we always say that we need to collaborate on projects, and that's how we build real valuable projects, because you bring in knowledge from so many different fields, so many different experiences, and we build the perfect product. So it means that obviously learning should also follow collaboration. But he says that once you begin to put them in that constant comparison, then collaboration would also decline. And that's a danger. But it's not just about collaboration declining. You know what also declines? Risk taking, curiosity. All these things begin to decline. And it's dangerous for learners, because at the end of the day, these are the things that we want to see at the heart of teaching and learning. And you see, there are some questions that students ask themselves. Let me give you an example. Why would I attempt a difficult question if failure will drop my average? Why would I explore creatively? If I deviate, I may risk a lower grade. So these are the kind of questions that students ask themselves. Obviously, it may not be the same way I have asked, but in very different forms. And this is actually real. If you've spoken to a lot of educators, they'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you today. So it means that at the end of the day, the system we have adopted teaches caution. And anybody who knows about caution will tell you that it is literally the barrier in the face of innovation. And obviously, everybody says, let's innovate, let's innovate, let's innovate, and all of that. But once the system in itself, at its core, is teaching caution, then we are even curtailing innovation before we even talk about it. You get it? So I think that it's important for us to pause for a moment and begin to ask a far more deeper question. And that question is simple. Please listen closely here. Why are we so comfortable with the idea that intelligence must be distributed the same way we distribute height? Why? Because I'm thinking human intelligence is not some fixed biological measurement. And so I'm a bit worried. And that's why I'm asking that question. Because if intelligence is influenced by our environment, our teaching quality, the feedback cycles we have, our emotional safety, even things like our sleep, our nutrition, our cultural context, the opportunities we have, then we could actually say that intelligence is dynamic. It grows. You get the question, or you get the understanding I'm trying to put out here. But if at some point we just get a snapshot of it and we say that's what students are, then I think it's quite dangerous for us to begin to think around those lines, to be very honest. You can't ask yourself that question too and then probably take a couple of minutes to think about it before you continue watching this video, if that works with you. I just want some more deeper connection to the very context of education, because if we need to see education grow, then these are the hard questions we need to be asking ourselves. Now, let's take a quick pause. I want us to look at a classroom that is built around ranking, okay? And that would feed into the earlier conversation that we had, but I want us to do this just now. Think about that class that is built around ranking. Obviously, you begin to realize that your peers are not your collaborators, they are actually your competitors. So you're in a competition with them. And sometimes, this is something that we don't say a lot of times, but if you see someone succeed, it feels like your loss, if you be very honest with yourself. And I think that if grades are really curved, like the statisticians want to see or the mathematicians want to see, then one student's success may mathematically require another student's failure to some extent. If I'm getting an A, then mathematically, for the curve to make sense, somebody has to get a C. And I don't think this is education. This is like engineering scarcity, like saying the thing is there in very limited quantity, so somebody has to grab it first. Somebody needs to suffer. I don't think that's really what education is about. And you see, scarcity also shapes behavior, because it means that what students are now doing is they are optimizing for grades, really not understanding. And I think that's the reason why a lot of teachers teach to the test. They don't teach to get students to be curious about the concept. And you see, it's not just teachers. I think the entire system. Think about parents. Parents are also measuring the worth of their students by the transcripts they bring home, by the report cards, not really about the transformation that has been seen within these students. And I think at some point, the bell curve becomes self-justifying, because then some people must fail, because the model actually needs it to happen that way. But then I ask myself, what if we rejected that assumption? What if we believe that intelligence is not a limited commodity, it's not scarce, it is not something that's supposed to be distributed, but it's actually a capacity that needs to be developed? What if we did that? What would happen? And I think I'm not the only person who is thinking this way, because Ken Robinson also thought of that. And you see, he argued that schools a lot of times suppress creativity rather than cultivate it. And I'm sure a lot of people have said this, and it's quite a controversial way to put it, though. But I think one of the ways that happens, according to him, is when schools begin to have very narrow metrics of success. Because if academic performance is the primary currency, then every other form of intelligence is marginalized. Artistic intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, practical problem solving, being entrepreneurial, all these things become marginalized, second place. And you see, these things also really don't fit within that curved grading system. So obviously they'll be sidelined. You get it. But I think at some point I need to start and having this conversation with you. Let's think of a different philosophy, okay? And I think I've talked a lot about the bell curve, bell curve, bell curve. What if we took that out? What kind of world will exist? Let's begin to imagine that philosophy, and I'll take you through that. Of course, let me just say this before I move in. I'm not saying that the existence of the current system is terrible. In fact, it's quite functional. I'm not calling for the scrapping of it, but I think we need to really evaluate it to see how we can make it better. Let's go back to our new philosophy. Imagine a school where the grades are really not comparative, but let me say they are standard based. Okay, so students are not, or students are evaluated against some learning targets. They are not evaluated against themselves or each other. And I think that exists to some degree, because that's what we normally call the standard based grading. So here the question is quite simple: have you met the standard? If not, what support do you need? And obviously, you agree with me that here time has to be flexible, because obviously, if you don't meet the standard, we need to give you room to be able to do this. And I would argue that this actually exists a lot in apprenticeship situations or in the very technical areas, but not in the general classroom experience. And the truth of the matter here is that with such a system, or in that kind of a world, feedback is actually very central. And I think that revision is something that is very normal within those phases. When you fail to, it's actually information, it's not your identity. And I think this is how we need to begin to envision education. Not that we radically probably scrape out this entire system, but that philosophy would help us model our current system in ways that are more functional, valuing feedback and revision. And I think that there are even some much more radical approaches. So some institutions, for example, have tried doing ungrading. So the feedback is the currency. Numerical scoring doesn't exist. And others to use what we call the contract grading. So it's like you and your students will agree in advance. So what is the level of work that you need to be able to get some particular grade? You get it. So it's not like you do an exam, then we give you A, B, C. No, this time you and your students co-create what the level of difficulty should be in achieving some form of a grade, and they work towards it. And I won't say that these systems don't have challenges. They do. In fact, they have a lot of challenges. And even beyond those challenges, you agree that you need professional judgment, you need cultural shifts, you need trust. And all of those things make it quite difficult, but they rest on a very different belief that learning is not a race, it's development. And I, for one, have loved to see education within this space because the competition, though good in some aspects, is really hurting students at the very core. And I think that that's the point where we need to confront that difficult tension within it. But let me say this again, okay? When you think of universities, they are limited seats. It's not that everybody can just go there. When you go to the job space, like for example, as I run EduGuard Insight, I obviously will not just take anybody. There needs to be some filters, okay? So it means that selection mechanisms would always exist. For that, I can agree with you. But my question here is, should selection define the entirety of education? That's why I begin to question. So it's not that I'm saying that filters existing is a bad thing. No. But should it define the entirety of education? Is a school primarily some sorting mechanism, or is it supposed to be an ecosystem where we are learning? Because if sorting is what is dominating very early on, and it's dominating very aggressively, I think that so many students will begin to disengage even before the potential they have even matures. Because one of the things people don't see is that there are people who are late bloomers. And I think that this system punishes them because there are so many early metrics that pull them down. And you see, if you have different pacing, we begin to see that as deficiency in the space. And to some extent, we label it as being objective. But I think that's a really dangerous thing to even have a conversation on in the first place. But let's take a pause, okay? I've been having this conversation so long. In fact, I have so much to say about this. And that's the reason why I've not even stopped to sip some water and even go on with the conversation. But I think I need to at some point. But let's still go on with the conversation. Let's go back to our original assumption, okay? And here we are going back to the bell curve whole narrative and all of that. We all agree that the bell curve is describing some statistical distribution, right? So obviously, it does not describe destiny. Let me put it that way. But when we design systems that assume that failure is inevitable, I would say that most often than not, we begin to create it. Okay? Because when we assume that only a minority of students can excel, I think that we begin to allocate resources also according to that same structure. And I think that at some point, when we begin to label students early, we narrow the trajectories for them. And then we look at the outcomes and we say, well, the curve was right. But what if that curve was actually reinforced by us? What if we did that? You get it? So I think there's a whole literal narrative that this conversation is meant to help us have. It's supposed to be that counter conversation that would help you reflect on what education would look like. So my question then would be, what would schools look like if we genuinely believe that everybody could learn? What would schools look like? I think that what would happen here, and this is what I want to propose to so many schools, or probably to teachers watching this. I think that to some extent you can fit this within the normal school calendar or within the normal sessions that we have. I think that what would begin to normalize a lot is revision. Yeah, would begin to normalize revision a lot. And I think that what assessment to begin to prioritize is feedback and not just ranking. You may still go ahead with your ranking, but you'd prioritize feedback a lot. And I think that at some point, you'd also begin to flex around the time a bit so that you can have mastery. Because to be honest, that's what you want. You want them to meet a standard. And I think that at some point, the collaboration that is lost because of the competition would now be incentivized. It will not be undermined. I think that when people are struggling, teachers will begin to frame that as growth, not some evidence that they cannot reach there. Teachers would become people who are diagnosing all the time. They want to see whether you understand. They will not be people that just say, well, if you joke with me, I'll give you a C. And I've seen that a lot in the university. So it's like now we threaten grades because we know grades are what we can use to label students. I think that would no longer be the job of teachers or the perspective teachers would view education. It would much more be about how well are you understanding this? You're not just distributing grades. And you see, for students, they'll begin to see their peers as their own partners, not their threats. And I can say this for a fact, I teach at the primary school level science. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm the teacher that students like a lot. I'm not saying this to get a name or something, but obviously that's the truth. If you come to my space, you realize that almost every time students are all over me. I'm with students as well. I like students being around. I love that kind of environment. And when I have a conversation with one of my students, in fact, she has been at the school, I think somewhere from grade 1. Currently, she is in grade 6. And she tells me that she's been in that school for a long time, and to a point, somewhere in the first 3 years, she used to be the one that was always at the top, receiving awards. But unfortunately, when one student came in, I don't know whether I should use the word unfortunately or fortunately, but to her, it's obviously unfortunate. One student came in, she no longer had an award. So it means that that student was scooping the awards or stealing the awards from her. And honestly, we had a whole deep conversation about that to show why education was about collaboration and that she just needed to probably work even harder. So that to fit within the normal conversation now and not to view that extra or that student as a threat. But this is something that happens a lot. For most students that are really at the A level, at the very top of the curve, that we think that these are the students that are doing really well, the extremes, which is really above average, they honestly don't view each other as partners. No. To them, the other person is a threat. They are working to beat that person. I don't think that's a good space of education that we need to have. Imagine that's the kind of narrative we are building out there. How would we be able to get students out of school to be able to collaborate on projects when all their lives they've been seeing their peers as their threats, not really as their partners? I think that's a very dangerous thing. I also think that when we begin to shape our schools around this mastery-based learning in our minds, what would happen is that we would begin to view excellence as a thing that is about depth, not really about dominance. And somebody will say, well, this is some utopian kind of thinking. No, I think that it's much more philosophical, because do we believe that intelligence is fixed and scarce, or do we think that it's expandable, it's contextual? I think that our grading is something that reveals the answer. So at the end of the day, I would want to leave you with this. I've been having this long conversation without even sipping water. My bottle fell not too long ago, and I don't want to have to cut the video to continue this conversation. So I'm going to leave you with this. If a classroom produces exactly the distribution we expect every year, and think about it, not that we are having the same students, we are having different students coming every year, but we are producing the same distribution every year, I think that we need to start asking whether we are measuring learning or we are enforcing a pattern. because I think we are getting too comfortable about seeing that pattern and saying that is how education is supposed to be. What if we are on the wrong side and forcing a pattern when we could actually create real education? Because if 10% of our students should always fail, then perhaps failure is structural. It means that we really have a reinforced that system within the kind of structure we have within our schools. And as teachers, I don't think that's how we view education. That's not how we want to build our students. But you see, obviously, the bell curve, it's powerful in statistics. But I think that when we apply it to human potential and we really don't critically examine it, we create a limit to humans. We create a limit to education. Because in my opinion, I think education should expand possibility. It shouldn't normalize limitations. And most of the times, I think that one of the things that we need to really agree on is everyone can learn. The real question is whether the system that we built is really designed to allow for true learning. That's the question I need us to think about. So yeah, thank you for having this conversation with me. It's a long conversation where I didn't even sip water and all of that, but it's been on my heart for quite a while. Obviously not saying that we need to stop the whole kind of system that we have. No, it has its benefits. It's efficient. It allows companies to run and all of that. But I think we need to rethink this. If I had the chance to inform educational policy, I think at the heart of it, I would be looking at policies that would minimize the damages that exist with normative grading and the very concept of the bell curve. And yeah, I would announce a package soon, something that will be done through EduGuard Insights and all. So be expecting that as well. Thank you for listening. And this is EduGuard Podcast. This is my solo content long. I'm hoping that you enjoy it. You can always reach out to me if there's anything you need me working on. And yeah, I also just got this microphone. It's a nice one. I hope that you enjoyed this video and my sound is clearer. A number of you reached out earlier and know that the sound was a bit pitchy. Thank you. We have a new one. Hopefully this one works better. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.